Rob, and this is a question for all of you, I guess, though. I mean, can we get to that point? Because it was also, not coincidentally, those students could have ended up going to Vietnam. They had, there was an incredible amount of stakes for them that were very explicit. Tuesday, I could be gone. And on top of that, we had come through a period which Krugman calls the Great Compression, where there was at least a sense of financial security, that if I go out and get arrested, so what? I'll go get my job from IBM or whatever it is, and I'll be there for 30 years. That's just the way it works. That doesn't exist today. Rob, I want to hear, and then from you both, if we can have a movement where people are willing to get that angry and deal, particularly when we see what happened in New York City. You know, we had cops, you know, knocking on people's doors. We saw the presentation of it here. Is there room for that? I mean, how bad does it have to get? And, you know.
Well, you're asking a lot of interesting questions. One of the things that I
2
saw.
minutes to.
I got you. I got you. When I went down to Zuccotti Park, one of the things that I noticed was how conflicted the police were. Early on, when they were talking to New York teachers, they saw themselves as next in line in terms of the cuts, and they were very conflicted when things would rise up about what role they should play. The students in Zuccotti Park were fascinating. And even in that respect, my son is fascinating. They were actually relieved that we were taking away this carcass of this conforming to this ideology, the unconscious civilization that John Ralston talked about. They were relieved they didn't have to keep playing that game or playing those codes. And so, but at the same time, and I think definitely the liberal class had a lot to say about this, people want to feel good. And when they can't, like a football running back, they can't see any daylight upfield, they sometimes buy false resolution just to alleviate their anxiety. So it has to get deeper, and it has to get more painful. But when Bill Grider, who I think is one of those prophetic witnesses of our society, was writing his book called Who Will Tell the People, he called me and he said, "Rob, what's the magic bullet?" And I'd read the whole manuscript. I said, "Bill, it's outrage. It's action. It's rebellion." He said, "That's right." But the question is, when do we get to that point? We got a taste of it with Occupy. But that is where we have to go. And we have a lot of smart people in this room that want to get that Titanic off the ice. And that's what we have to do.
Students today, are they in any way constricted by the sort of insecurity that they have about the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the questions that we get a lot, so the way Roosevelt is organized is we are a grassroots organization. So my job as national director is beholden to the students, which means that their ideas and what they're passionate about and what they're working on is what we elevate as an organization. We get a lot of questions sometimes of like, why don't we see more of what we saw in the 60s and 70s, like that kind of activism? And I don't have an answer to that. I think that, yes, some of the insecurity that we have, and I think this goes back to actually what the Roosevelt Institute really talks a lot about, that there has been for the last 20, 30 years this narrative that has defined the way that we interact with the system. And it's very difficult to move beyond that narrative when that's all you've ever known. And this generation, born in the late 80s or mid 80s and the 90s now, that's what we know. And I think so it's difficult sometimes, I think, for millennials and for young people to think, what is the alternative? And I think that's what Occupy really did. The fact that you went from a news cycle that solely focused on debt and deficit into one that talked about equality, that's what Occupy did. I think when it gets back to whether the insecurity that they're feeling filters into like whether the rage will get there, I wish I had an answer to that. I think that the student debt, I mean, it's an easy thing to focus on because it's something that directly impacts what young people are directly feeling in that moment. But I think what's also very unique is this is a really empathetic generation, because you see this massive interest in what's happening with climate change. Like, there's this massive interest in like thinking about how your actions as an individual here in the United States affects the person living over in Africa, which is something that I think at the end of the day is going to be the key formula of, can we get back this sense of community spirit, and then recognize that that's going to take the combination of the community spirit and a lot of pissed off people to make something happen. But in terms of an answer of like what that exactly looks like, I don't know.
Patrick, before we take the questions from the audience, I'm curious, I mean, do you see that any change in sort of the radicalization with the people that you work with? Because on some level, they don't, it doesn't get much worse at that point. But
yeah, I mean, it's I think for the folks we're working with, it oscillates between outrage, and this is a group of folks who've been, as I said, I think who've been so sacrificed by all of the sort of structural and sort of economic and political changes of the last 30 years. These are the folks that have been marginalized. They know what's happened. I mean, they know inchoately what's happened, and so there's outrage, but it's they're living lives in crisis. Right. Their survival is literally at question every day. And what I think was actually interesting about Occupy, and it's a question that hasn't been answered yet, and it's is the alliances that started to be made between the activists that were there and community organizing groups. I mean, here in New York we saw that, where there was a lot of sort of synergy, and this continues between community organizing groups and groups there. Like, so folks that were really working in the community, doing tenant organizing, doing labor organizing on the very local level at the local market or whatever, and then labor, and I think that's an organized labor, and I think that's that the test is going to be sort of where that goes, and it's what actually got the folks that we were working with, homeless and formerly homeless people, and in other states and communities as well. It got them interested as well, as that idea of like maybe the discourse that Occupy is kind of highlighting and amplifying about income inequality, about the 99% and that 1% is exactly what we've seen and exactly what we're living. But I think how you translate that outrage into pushing for more change. And I will just also say too, and I say this as someone who works for a group that is part of that sort of social services left, the kind of the groups that, when they recognized the failure of government, beginning in the 60s and 70s, stepped in and started doing the work that government ought to have been doing in communities, community-based groups. I think there's also needs to be a recognition by the kind of nonprofit world and the NGOs and all of that they need to play a different role too, and it needs to be an activist role instead of the role that sort of just has them, doing the work that government ought to have been doing in the first place. We should be making government do that.
Sure, please.
I covered 20 years overseas, a variety of movements and revolutions and insurrections from Latin America to the Middle East to most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. And it's always the ruling elite that determines the parameters of rebellion. When Conrad Black wrote his biography of Roosevelt, he said that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. The New Deal functioned the way liberal institutions are supposed to function in a democratic capitalist society, as a kind of safety valve. It makes incremental and piecemeal reform possible. Those institutions have been destroyed by corporate capitalism in their myopia, because ultimately they, in essence, have destroyed not only their own legitimacy, but ultimately their own viability. And in all of the movements that I covered, you never know what triggers it. It's usually something incredibly banal. But the fact that the state decided to respond to the Occupy movement not by instituting minimal reforms, such as a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, or a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, or a forgiveness of student debt, or the public option, which Obama and the insurance companies killed for us. the fact that the only message that it delivered was the message of force means that they have determined that rebellion is not going to go away. And these, if you watch the trajectory of any movement, it doesn't move in a kind of linear progression upwards. Even the civil rights movement, you know, great failures in Albany, Mississippi, and everywhere else. King trying to hold this fractured, group together. What has been unleashed, I think, can't be stopped. And just as 1905 was the dress rehearsal in Petrograd for 1917, just as the Stamp Act Rebellion in 1765 was the dress rehearsal for 1776, that moment when the federal authorities stepped in a concerted and organized effort to wipe out these encampments, for me, delivered the message. And that is that we have unleashed forces within this society that will confront these corporate systems of power. But what will spark it? It may be just an elderly woman in Utah being pushed out of her home. It will be something that seemingly insignificant that will tip people over the edge. And that's certainly what I saw in all of the movements that I covered. And let me just finally conclude by saying that the importance, and I've been down in Zuccotti, I was down there a few weeks ago with Father Daniel Berrigan, 92 years old. You know, the importance of continuing acts of resistance is that it keeps this narrative alive. When I was in Prague, I covered the Velvet Revolution in Prague. There were, through all the streets of the city, posters of a Charles University student named Jan Panic, who, to protest the Soviet invasion of Prague and the overthrow of Dubček in '68, had gone to Wenceslas Square, lit himself on fire, died 4 days later of his burns. Thousands of students marched with his body to the cemetery. It was broken up by the police. It was not reported on the state media. When his grave became a shrine, the communist authorities dug up his remains, cremated them, gave the ashes to his mother, and said that she was not allowed to rebury them. And his presence in the city that November and December was palpable. 2 weeks after the communist government fell, 10,000 people crowded into Red Army Square and renamed it Jan Panic Square. I was also there, 500,000 people, Wenceslas Square, snowing on a December night, when Marta Kubashaya, who had been, before 1968, the best-known singer in Czechoslovakia, and when the tanks rolled into the city, sung the anthem of defiance, broadcast over the radio. Once the pro-Soviet government was back in place, not only did she become a non-person, but they destroyed her entire recording stock, and she was not allowed to appear on the airwaves. From that moment until the Velvet Revolution, she had worked on an assembly line at a toy factory. And she walked out that night and sang that anthem, and everyone in that crowd knew every word. The power of resistance, as Havel says in his great 1978 essay, The Power of the Powerless, is that we speak a fundamental truth about this system that terrifies them.